When Identities Collide. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the triumph of Russia and Yeltsin, there is a lot of examination of what this all means and what happens with this collapse, what emerges. And one of the triumphs, seemingly, is that capitalism has been victorious over socialism. And it's something to consider and think about in your readings of at what cost was the triumph of capitalism, of the market over socialism, and who benefits and who gets left behind? What changes, what doesn't? I think a really interesting collection of interviews to read is a book that is edited by Donald Raleigh, Russia's Sputnik generation, Soviet baby boomers talk about their lives, where a group of people that sort of born and raised together talk about their lives as the post-World War II baby boomers in the Soviet Union, and the pride they had of their lives and how normal it seemingly was for them. And another highly recommended thing to get your hands on is My Perestroika. And it's a DVD, or you can also, I think, stream it. And it looks at the last generation of Soviets as they try to make sense of the world around them. And it really is a fabulous documentary, and I hope that you can watch it. If it was available just to add to the class, I would certainly make it available through Blackboard. Well, there's some grim figures that come out of this transition from socialism to capitalism. The economy is in shambles, and in 2000, the Russian gross domestic product fell to 55% of that of 1990, compared to the Soviet GDP, which only declining by 24% between 1941 and 1945. Now, 20% of the Russian population had maintained or improved their standard of living, but 40% lived in poverty, with about half of them with incomes below minimum subsistence level of $35 a month. One of the grim figures that I find particularly grim is that about 10% of the newborns are born without health problems. So it is a generation of newborns born with problems. And also another staggering and grim statistic, between 50 to 80% of school-age children are classified as having a physical or mental defect. And this is very much in contrast to what's supposed to be the promise of a Soviet family of healthy and strong. And I want to look at some graphs and some charts, and we'll go through them quickly, and then you probably will want to go back and look at them more fully. The growth of a population is a sign of a growing society, of a healthy, thriving society, and most indexes look at the growth of population as a sign of stability. And the population in Russia was declining and not increasing. In terms of the level of births, you can see it continued to sort of go downwards, and then there's an uptick then, which we'll get to. Natural growth, you can see just a sort of collapse of it, and then the deaths. So one of the other sort of grim things to keep in mind is that the Russian economy just bottomed out, and we'll be looking at this in more detail next week. But the Russian economy, it collapsed in August 1998. The stock markets and banks failed. This is known as Black Monday, August 17th. Also, it should be noted that the Russian economy relied and remains heavily reliant on its natural resources, particularly oil and natural gas. And then some other things to kind of consider. Again, in terms of a population that's not growing, part of the problem is that women are not reproducing. They're not having children. And if you're not reproducing, the society's not recovering. And there'd always been an understanding in Soviet society that children were valued and important and should be loved and nurtured. Even so, there were very high rates of abortions. There was a lack of contraceptives, and housing shortages made it really difficult to sort of realize the ideal family. But even so, if the ideal was not realized in the Soviet Union, you can see that the fertility rates really begin to go down during the 90s. And men are dying young. The life expectancy for men falls. Again, this is not a good sign. And here's another graph just to visually show you this. The Russian male life expectancy just tanks in the 90s. Now, there's going to be various reasons for this, and we'll look at them in more detail. But in part, it was these men were poisoning themselves and engaging in really unhealthy behaviors, and anti-alcohol campaigns did little to actually improve society, but just had men turning to other kinds of very poisonous things to drink. And there's sort of a correlation between homicides and alcohol consumption, as you can see during this year, and this spikes up. And so there's this grim picture of a young men dying much too young, drinking far too much, women not having children, and a population that is dying off. There's also sort of fear of the youth, and I think this can be expressed very well in this poster of what is going on with this generation, little by little, and you end up with a hooligan tolerance of drinking is dangerous. There is but a step from drinking to crime. That it is a population that is engaging in unhealthy behaviors and is unhealthy. And so what we have, I think, is a new stagnation of maybe a different sort. In part, you have a closed system, this closed unhealthy loop, where there's very little in terms of arrivals or departures. And you can see that compared to what it was previously, immigrants are not welcome, and people aren't leaving. And sort of overwhelmingly, I think in this you can see the collapse of the Soviet health system and social care, life expectancy in Russia compared to the United States between 1960 and 2015, and Russia is in the blue, and you can see then how this gap grows during these years. I want to look a little bit about how this affects women. The Soviet Union had made a great deal of promises for women to emancipate them, to liberate them, and to help them lead a beautiful, fulfilled life. And this poster, I think, does a wonderful job of really capturing what that promise was. And it was supposed to be a life of education, of help with raising a family, a cafeteria, a women's club, a school for adults, a nursery, that women were supposed to be equal. And that was one of the sort of great visions of what a socialist society was. It was an equal society, an equality between men and women. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, this idea of Soviet equality, even though oftentimes it was not real, it becomes even sort of less real. And I think the book by Palev and Homo sapiens gives you the sense of the total unreality of what happens with the collapse of the Soviet Union and during these wild Yeltsin years. When capitalism comes into the post-Soviet Union Russia, some of the people have made a lot of money very quickly and are spending it and showing it. And so you begin to have this conspicuous consumption of people with money and using it in places like Moscow. But it's important to remember at the same time where there's this new Russia, and they're showing their money, there's also the old Russia. And the old Russia, these women are being left behind and trying to figure out where they fit into, especially when their safety net has been abandoned. So there's a new Russia with new problems and some old ones. Democracy is supposed to protect rights, but the state doesn't do it. The discrimination of women is rampant. There's widespread unemployment, and women are the first fired. 2/3 of the unemployed previously, they were 50% of the workforce, so women are losing their jobs in the Yeltsin years. And there is this social attitude reinforced by Yeltsin and the Russian politicians that women should be at home and women should be taking care of their children. And on the other hand, you have this idea that women are supposed to be home and take care of their children, but you also have the more open discussion of sex. In the Soviet Union, sex was not something that was supposed to be discussed about. And patriarchy and chauvinism are deeply rooted in Russian society, and there has always been sort of this double burden in the Soviet society where women worked for the state and they also took care of their families. And they had tremendous challenges to face. There were very few contraceptives available. And because of the shortage of contraceptives, there were very high abortion rates, and the highest in the world. And in 1989, production of condoms amounted to about 3 condoms per year for every adult male. There's an average of 2 to 3 abortions for most women. And in 1990, the Soviet Union had 98.4 abortions per 1,000 women aged 15 to 49 and 127 per 1,000 born. And you can compare those numbers to Germany and the United States, and you can see how high those are. And a huge blockbuster to watch that sort of explores the late Soviet sex is Little Vera. It's a 1988 movie, and I recommend checking that out. Sexual violence was increasing, and I think that the rise of sexual violence is also a sign of a social crisis. In 1988, the official figure for rape and sexual assault was 17,658, and this official figure is much, much too low. But it increased in 1989 to 21,873, and that's not necessarily because of better reporting. Sexual harassment is constant, and pornography is everywhere and explicit after 1990. And I recommend checking out the Human Rights Watch Women's Rights Project. The Human Rights Watch Women's Rights Project online. Check it out. Well, the social expectations for the Soviet society and the Russian society, some had changed and some hadn't. Women had always been expected to take care of kids, but in the post-Soviet society, it was seen that mothers were not really employable because without any Soviet social daycares, the kids would have to be taken care of by their mothers, and the mothers then are going to be a liability. They won't show up because they have these kids. The cutback of Soviet services, there's no daycares, there's no nurseries. Women can't work in part because they have to take care of their kids. There's no place to put them. Oftentimes women are the single heads of household. They have been divorced. They are the most impoverished. They are the most unemployed. And in 1992, 55% of Russian women households with children under 6 lived below poverty. There's no government protection. The state does nothing. This is the consequence of privatization and attitudes. The sexual abuse of women by employers is notorious and well known. The lawlessness of new businesses see women as just sexual services. There's high rates of spousal abuse, and the police don't do anything about this because of the family matter that it's designated as. And there's, again, pornography everywhere. And seeing this visual denigration of women, I think, does affect society. So you might want to think about what does this all mean, and how does patriarchy fit into the Russian idea. And these are some ways to sort of legitimize why women were treated less than equal at this time. And we'll be looking at politics next.